My name is Peggy Beck, 31 years old. People always tell me I have my father's patience. I usually laugh because they mistake silence for patience. My father rarely wasted words, but every decision he made carried the weight of 30 years of experience. It took me a long time to understand that the quietest person in a room is sometimes the one everyone should fear the most. I own a small plumbing and tile remodeling business in central Ohio. I've been running it for nearly 8 years, after starting as a helper on my father's crew when I was 19. By 23, I had earned my own license, and by 25, I was working for myself. Kitchens, bathrooms, complete remodels, whatever honest people needed. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid my mortgage, kept my truck running, and gave me something I could genuinely be proud of. My online reviews sat at 4.8 stars, with dozens of happy customers. Until this story, I'd never had a payment dispute. My father was the real craftsman. 30 years as a master plumber and tile specialist had given him almost supernatural instincts. He could step into a bathroom and immediately notice a floor dipping less than half an inch. When I was little, I watched him tear out work he'd already finished simply because one tile wasn't perfectly aligned. Back then, I thought he was impossible to satisfy. Today, I understand why customers sought him out for decades. He had retired mostly. Sometimes he helped me on larger projects, but these days he preferred tending vegetables in his backyard, repairing little things around his house, and watching old westerns with a mug of coffee beside him. Since my mother passed away 4 years earlier, he'd become even quieter. Not lonely, just more selective about where he spent his energy. If he touched something, it was done correctly. No shortcuts, no excuses. About 2 months before everything exploded, I received a referral from one of my happiest clients. She introduced me to a married couple I'll call Michael and Diane Carlisle. They wanted their master bathroom completely renovated. New porcelain tile, new shower surround, fresh grout, trim, everything. Their home sat inside one of those immaculate neighborhoods where every lawn looked identical and every mailbox seemed approved by an overly enthusiastic homeowners association. Diane greeted me carrying a thick 3-ring binder. Not metaphorically, an actual binder. Inside were magazine clippings, printed Pinterest photos, paint swatches, grout samples, tile comparisons, handwritten notes, and colored tabs dividing everything into neat categories. She had planned this bathroom for months, maybe years. After measuring everything, I quoted $4,800 for labor and materials. Honestly, it was lower than many contractors would have charged because the referral mattered to me. If I impressed one homeowner there, dozens more renovations could follow as those houses aged. Michael barely reacted to the number. Diane carefully wrote it into her binder before asking me to separate labor from materials. I explained every dollar. She studied the estimate with narrowed eyes before finally nodding. We signed a detailed contract covering payment, scope of work, and completion dates. Everything looked straightforward. Monday morning, I started demolition. The old installer had practically glued the previous tile to the floor with enough thinset to build another house, so removing everything took nearly an entire day. Fortunately, the subfloor underneath remained solid. Over the next several days, I installed beautiful porcelain tile in the staggered pattern Diane had personally selected. Every grout joint followed industry standards. I sealed everything properly, color-matched the silicone around every transition, and even completed small finishing touches many contractors would have billed as extras. The bathroom looked stunning. But Diane never stopped watching. Every 45 minutes, she appeared with her phone. She photographed every stage, compared each picture against something inside her binder, pointed toward individual tiles. This one looks darker than the sample. Should that edge be this close to the wall? I think this grout line feels wider. Each time, I explained calmly. Porcelain naturally varies in color. Spacing remained well within industry tolerances. I showed her levels, measurements, manufacturer specifications. She would nod politely, then return an hour later, asking almost the exact same question with slightly different wording. Michael behaved differently. He rarely entered the bathroom, but whenever he did, he smiled awkwardly and said the same sentence. You know, Diane just has very high standards. Eventually, I noticed something. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't perfectionism. They weren't trying to improve the project. They were documenting reasons not to pay. I'd seen enough difficult customers over the years to recognize the pattern, but I convinced myself I was overthinking it. Friday afternoon, I completed the remodel. I cleaned every surface until the room practically reflected light. During the final walkthrough, Diane inspected every tile one last time, flipping through page after page inside her binder while taking dozens of new photographs. Finally, she closed the binder. I'll need a few days to evaluate everything before we release payment. I forced a polite smile. That's perfectly fine. According to our agreement, payment is due within 5 business days. She simply nodded. Monday came. Nothing. Tuesday. Nothing. Wednesday, I texted Michael. Diane is still evaluating. Thursday, I called Diane myself. She answered immediately, almost as if she'd been waiting beside her phone. Without saying hello, she launched into a rehearsed speech. The grout lines aren't perfectly consistent. One tile near the toilet feels uneven. The tile colors don't match. The shower threshold isn't level. I even rolled a marble across it. Saturday, I returned carrying my level, measuring tools, manufacturer documentation, and every piece of evidence I could possibly need. One by one, I addressed every complaint. The grout spacing measured perfectly within tolerance. The tiny lip near the toilet measured only a couple of millimeters and remained completely acceptable under industry standards. The color differences came directly from the porcelain product she had personally selected. Then I placed my 4-foot level across the shower threshold. The bubble rested perfectly centered. It doesn't look level, Diane insisted. That single sentence told me everything. Facts no longer mattered. Measurements didn't matter. Truth didn't matter. This wasn't about craftsmanship anymore. It was about finding any excuse possible to avoid writing a check. I looked directly at both of them. My work meets every standard listed in our contract. I expect payment by the end of this week. Diane folded her arms. We'll think about it. Michael escorted me toward the front door. Before I stepped outside, he lowered his voice. You know, some contractors would simply absorb the loss to keep good customer relationships. I stared at him for a long second before quietly walking away. That evening, I sat in my truck outside my own house for nearly 15 minutes. Not because I was angry, because I was exhausted. Small business owners don't have corporations covering unpaid invoices. That $4,800 represented mortgage payments, insurance, payroll, truck maintenance, and groceries. A week later, still nothing. I mailed a certified demand letter. No response. When I finally reached Diane again, she claimed an unnamed professional friend had inspected my work and agreed it was substandard. She couldn't provide a name, a license, or a single measurable defect. That Sunday, I carried sandwiches to my father's house like I always did. We sat at the same old kitchen table where I'd eaten dinner since childhood. For almost 20 minutes, I unloaded everything. The binder, the fake complaints, the missing payment, the mysterious expert, the threat that I should simply accept the loss. Dad listened without interrupting once. When I finally stopped talking, he slowly lifted his coffee mug, took one sip, placed it back on the table, looked me straight in the eyes, and quietly said, "Get me their phone number." The next morning, my father called the Carlyles. I wasn't sitting beside him, but later he repeated the conversation almost word for word. He introduced himself politely. "My name is Frank Beck. I'm Peggy's father. I've worked in plumbing and tile installation for over 30 years. There was a brief pause. Then he continued. My daughter told me about your concerns. As a father and as someone who takes pride in this trade, I'd like to come inspect everything myself. If I believe anything needs correcting, I'll personally fix it at no cost. He told me Diane's attitude changed instantly. Oh, Mr. Beck, that's exactly the kind of professionalism we've been hoping for. She practically gushed. It's refreshing to speak with someone who still believes in real craftsmanship. Then came the sentence that quietly transformed my father's expression. I wish Peggy had inherited your attention to detail. Dad repeated those words to me without emotion. No anger, no sarcasm, just facts. But I knew him well enough to notice the tiny pause before he continued. That was the exact moment this stopped being about money. It became personal. Saturday morning, he drove to their house carrying his old leather tool bag, the same one he'd used for decades. Inside were grout tools, a bucket, measuring instruments, and something else. The night before, I'd watched him walk into his garage and return carrying half a cup of ordinary granulated sugar and one of those plastic honey bears from the grocery store. What are you doing? I'd asked. He looked at me calmly. Insurance. That was all he'd say. When Diane opened the front door, she welcomed him like a celebrity. She eagerly walked him into the bathroom, flipping through her binder while pointing at every imaginary flaw she'd documented. This grout line. This corner. This transition. This tile. Dad crouched beside each one, nodding thoughtfully. I understand. I see. We'll make this right. He played the role perfectly. Not once did he defend me. Not once did he suggest the work was already correct. Instead, he apologized for our family's standards slipping. Diane absolutely loved hearing it. She smiled the entire time. When the inspection ended, Dad politely asked for one favor. I work better alone. Old habit. Would you mind giving me a few hours? Of course, Diane answered immediately. We were leaving to run errands anyway. Dad watched through the front window until their SUV disappeared around the corner. Then he locked the front door. Silence filled the house. Later, he told me he didn't begin working right away. Instead, he simply sat on the bathroom floor. 5 full minutes. Looking, studying, planning. He wasn't thinking like a contractor anymore. He was thinking about airflow, humidity, water movement, hidden corners, warm surfaces. If insects were looking for food, he later told me, where would they travel first? Only after answering that question did he open his tool bag. He carefully removed grout from a handful of nearly invisible locations. Behind the toilet, along the inside edge of the shower floor, tiny joints where the wall met the tile, corners most homeowners never examine. Not enough to attract attention, just enough. He mixed a fresh batch of grout inside his bucket. Everything looked completely normal, until he quietly poured in the sugar. He stirred slowly until every grain disappeared into the mixture. Then, before filling several deeper joints near the shower base, he squeezed thin ribbons of honey into the cavities. Not much, just enough. He packed fresh grout over everything, smoothed every joint, matched every texture, cleaned every surface. By the time he finished, the bathroom actually looked even better than before. My father's finishing work bordered on perfection. No one could have spotted the repaired sections. When Michael and Diane returned that afternoon, Dad was sitting peacefully on their front porch drinking bottled water while reading an old fishing magazine he'd found on their coffee table. Diane rushed straight inside. Nearly 20 minutes passed. I can still picture it from the way Dad described her. She crouched, touched every grout line, photographed every wall, compared everything against her binder. Finally, she emerged wearing the biggest smile he'd seen all day. It's pristine. That was the exact word she used. Pristine. Michael shook Dad's hand. This is what we expected from the beginning. Dad smiled politely. I'm glad you're satisfied. He loaded his tools into his truck, returned the magazine, drove home. That evening, I asked how everything had gone. He simply hung his jacket by the door. It's handled. I assumed he'd repaired something cosmetic. I thanked him for trying to help. He only nodded and turned on an old Western. For nearly 10 days, neither of us mentioned the Carlyles again. Then, one evening, Dad invited me over for dinner. After we finished eating, he poured himself another cup of coffee. Without looking at me, he quietly said, I should probably explain what I actually did. He described every step, the sugar, the honey, the exact grout joints he'd chosen. I stared at him in complete disbelief. Dad, he raised one finger. Listen first. Then he explained the science. Sugar weakens cement-based grout over time because it interferes with the curing process. Tiny cracks eventually develop. Moisture follows. Honey and sugar also become an irresistible food source, especially inside warm, humid bathrooms. Ants always send scouts first, he said. They find food. They leave chemical trails. Then the colony follows. He leaned back in his chair. I only gave nature a reason to visit. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Where did you even learn something like that? He smiled for the first time all evening. About 20 years ago, I repaired a bathroom where another handyman spilled soda inside a wall before sealing everything up. He paused. The homeowners ended up tearing out the entire wall because ants had moved in. You remembered? I remember every mistake I've ever seen. I rubbed both hands across my face. What if someone figures it out? Dad looked almost amused. Figures out what? You altered their grout. I replaced defective grout with fresh Portland cement grout. And the sugar? He shrugged. If bugs appear, they'll call pest control. If grout cracks, they'll blame moisture. No one sends grout samples to a laboratory. His calmness unsettled me more than anything he'd actually done. He wasn't excited. He wasn't proud. He wasn't angry. He sounded like a professor explaining why gravity works. Before I left, he walked me to the front porch. The evening air felt unusually quiet. You know, I finally said, I don't think I could ever do what you just did. He smiled faintly. I hope you never have to. Then he added something I'll never forget. Kind people mistake patience for weakness. He looked toward the dark street before continuing. But every family has one person who's willing to become the villain when someone tries to steal from the people they love. 3 weeks later. My phone buzzed. It was the neighbor who had originally referred the Carlyles to me. Her message contained only one sentence. Have you heard what's happening at Diane's house? You won't believe it. I opened the message immediately. Have you heard what's happening at Diane's house? You won't believe it. I called her. She didn't even wait for me to say hello. Peggy, they've got ants everywhere. I frowned, pretending to be confused. Ants? Hundreds of them. They're coming out of the bathroom floor. Diane's completely freaking out. I looked out my kitchen window and forced myself to sound surprised. That's strange. Strange? My neighbor laughed. She's been posting non-stop in the neighborhood Facebook group, asking for emergency exterminators. After hanging up, curiosity got the better of me. I searched the neighborhood page. Sure enough, there was Diane's post. 4 long paragraphs describing how she'd walked into her bathroom that morning and found ants pouring from the grout lines, gathering behind the toilet and crawling along the base of the shower. She ended her post with one sentence that almost made me choke on my coffee. We just had this bathroom professionally remodeled. Professional. Interesting choice of words. Over the next week, the story spread quickly. One neighbor told me Diane had started knocking on doors before sunrise, asking if anyone else had experienced an infestation. Another said she'd barely slept in days. The first exterminator sprayed the bathroom, placed bait stations, promised everything would disappear. It didn't. 2 days later, the ants came back. The second company used stronger treatments. They traced insect trails behind the bathroom baseboards and into the adjoining bedroom. Still, no permanent solution. Then, something even worse happened. Cockroaches appeared. Apparently, the constant warmth and moisture inside the bathroom had created the perfect environment once the insects discovered the hidden food source. The infestation slowly spread beyond the bathroom walls. According to one neighbor, Diane's walk-in closet became part of the problem. Boxes, shoes, shelving, nothing felt safe anymore. I shouldn't admit it, but I laughed. Not because bugs are funny, because I remembered Michael telling me some contractors should simply eat the loss. Apparently, nature disagreed. A few days later, my phone rang. The caller ID read, Diane Carlisle. I answered professionally. Peggy speaking. Her voice sounded completely different. No confidence, no superiority, only exhaustion. I wanted to ask you something. Of course. Is there any chance something during your tile installation could have caused a pest problem? I kept my voice calm. Bathroom tile and grout don't create insect infestations. Silence. She hesitated before asking another question. What about your father? My father? Could he have accidentally introduced something during the repairs? I almost smiled. Instead, I answered exactly as any professional would. My father has worked in this industry for over 30 years. He's never received a single complaint involving pests. Another long silence. Finally, she whispered, Okay. Then she hung up. I placed my phone on the kitchen counter, made myself a turkey sandwich, and somehow the ordinary routine made the entire conversation feel even stranger. Meanwhile, the neighborhood rumor mill kept producing updates. 3 pest control companies. None solved the problem. Finally, a senior technician reached a conclusion. There appears to be some kind of organic attractant inside the bathroom structure. Organic attractant. Nobody knew exactly what that meant, but the recommendation was devastating. Remove every affected tile. Remove the grout. Treat the subfloor. Disinfect the surrounding walls. Rebuild the bathroom from scratch. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had refused to pay me $4,800 for a flawless bathroom. Now they were paying someone else thousands more just to destroy it. Emergency demolition wasn't cheap. Neither were hotel stays. Neither were repeated exterminator visits. By the time neighbors finished comparing estimates, everyone believed the Carlisles had spent well over $14,000, more than triple what they'd originally refused to pay. When I mentioned the estimate to Dad during Sunday dinner, he quietly stirred his coffee. Expensive lesson. That was his entire reaction. Then he changed the subject and asked whether I'd planted tomatoes this summer. Life simply moved on. I didn't. I still wanted my money. So I filed a claim in small claims court. I organized everything: the signed contract, progress photographs, material invoices, text messages, certified demand letter, payment schedule. The hearing lasted barely 15 minutes. The Carlisles never appeared. The judge flipped through my evidence, asked whether the defendants had responded, then entered a default judgment in my favor. 3 weeks later, the payment arrived. Apparently, ignoring a court order proved much more difficult than ignoring my invoices. So, in the end, I received every dollar I had earned. Meanwhile, the Carlisles had spent roughly $14,000 fixing problems that never should have existed. Ironically, the entire situation improved my business. The neighbor who originally referred me apologized repeatedly. She felt guilty for introducing us. Instead of one customer, she ended up recommending me to 2 additional families on the same street. Both hired me. Both paid immediately. Both later referred friends. Good work has a funny way of surviving bad clients. About a month later, Diane tried one final attack. She posted a 1-star review online. She claimed my workmanship had caused endless problems and accused me of refusing responsibility. This time, I responded publicly. I uploaded photographs of the completed bathroom, manufacturer specifications showing the natural color variation she'd complained about, measurements documenting every tolerance, the signed contract, screenshots of our conversations, copies of the certified demand letter. Within days, more than a dozen previous customers commented beneath her review. They defended my work, shared their own experiences, praised my professionalism. A week later, Diane quietly deleted the review. Dad saw it before it disappeared. He simply shook his head. Some people never learn when to stop. Then he walked outside to water his tomato plants. A few months have passed since everything happened. Business has never been stronger. I'm booked nearly 5 weeks in advance now. Dad still joins me on larger remodels whenever he feels like getting out of the house. We don't talk much while we work. We never have. Sometimes the silence says everything. One afternoon, while packing tools into the truck, I finally asked him the question that had been living in my mind since all this began. Do you ever feel guilty? He stopped loading the truck, looked at me for a long moment. Not angry, not proud, just tired. They tried to steal from my daughter. Nothing more. He closed the tailgate, picked up his coffee, went back to work. That was the end of the conversation. Even now, I still don't know whether the final pest control company ever figured out exactly what had attracted the insects. Maybe they suspected. Maybe they never looked that closely. Maybe they simply fixed the damage and moved on. I honestly don't know. What I do know is this. I would never recommend doing what my father did. The legal system eventually gave me the money I deserved. That was justice. Everything else? That belonged to a quiet man who spent 30 years perfecting his craft and refused to let anyone steal from his family without paying a far greater price.